you in a few minutes. Before to begin, maybe I would like to make a special call from someone who maybe have the kindly to help us taking some photos, because we don't have any collaborator here with us to help us, and we are coordinating and participate, so it will be a bit difficult to do something. I don't know if someone has a tablet or a smartphone to take a little bit pictures of the people, and after we can share together and do it. Okay, just let you think about this, and we begin. We are just waiting to the last, the last PowerPoint. But how are we going to do? Okay, I'm going there. Yes, or you can begin. Okay. Oh, okay. If you can stay here, maybe the first.
You want me to change the slides?
Yes, it's okay. Vai ter ninguém. A gente pode se ajudar tirando fotos respectivamente. Colaboração aqui é ótima, né? There are just 2 slides, so it's very easy. So let's are going to begin. So I will explain a little bit the topic of our panel now and present the 4 panelists who are here. Maybe make a small contextualization on what's the goal of talking today about submarine cables and the governance of them. Submarine cables and internet exchange points play a crucial role in interconnectivity national and international networks into a complex network of submarine highways. Estimates shows that a 10% increase in broadband penetration brings around a 1.4% increase in terms of economical growth. But interconnection costs remain very high in developing countries, especially in Africa, due to various factors, including national telecom monopolies, lack of backbone infrastructure, or barriers to market access, but also in Latin America. In 2004-5, the Geneva Working Groups on Internet Governance, huge international agency to report on interconnection costs and fund initiatives that advance connectivity, internet exchange points, and local context from developing countries. Since then, several organizations have met the challenges and recommend to promote the liberalization of access to international gateways. Latin America and Africa, and generally all the BRICS, are passing through a request of huge transformation of their infrastructure, which is materializing with the construction of new submarine cables, satellites, backbones, and internet exchange points, like in Brazil, for example, to Europe and Africa. But without a favorable context on transparency, jurisdiction, and governance, the impact of new internet infrastructure can be reduced. This panel aims to build up an overview of these topics. And you can just go ahead, there are some questions we have put here. What outcomes shall additional submarine cables have on internet affordability in Latin America and BRICS countries, and how to maximize them? First question. Second question, how could sea cable consortia provider great transparency on the functioning and tariff policy? Third question, how can this change take place with a national legislation on telecommunication infrastructure that reduce public regulation like in Brazil? Or international gateways eligible to become collective goods, socially produced and governed on common pool resources? And how to reduce the high dependency of some countries in international broadband, especially in Africa and Latin America. This panel is the result of a research that we have beginning since the last year. We had already the opportunity to present this work in other international congress, like at the RightsCon in the beginning of this year in Brussels, and also in Brazil in the Fórum da Governança Nacional da Internet. And for us, it's a big opportunity to present this first part of these results today. And so the aim, the goal of this panel is to talk about this very rarely discussed point and have the possibility to share with all the participants insights and online in order to improve our collective reflection of these topics. I'm going now to introduce our 4 panelists who will have each one more or less 12 minutes to present their presentation, and after we will have a debate, more or less 40 minutes for a debate, where everybody will be invited to comment, critique, contributing with all the experience of each one have here in this beautiful community of internet governance. So you can just pass here. We will begin our presentation with Roxana Radu. She is representing the technical community at the Diplo Foundation in Switzerland, and she will talk about balance and perspective of the outcome of submarine cables in the international legislation and governance internet. After, we will talk with Peter Misek. He is representative of the civil society, global policy and legal consult at Access Now in New York. And with him, we will talk about internet shutdown and censorship and the urgency of new internet gateways. And then we will hear the presentation of Veridiana Alimonti. She is also representative of the civil society and lawyer, member of the Director Council of Intervozes in Brazil. And she will make a general point of view of the governance in Latin America, regional infrastructure of the ecosystem of relationship between provider, users, and citizens. And at the end of these groups, we will talk with Félix Blanc. He is representative of the technical community, researcher. He has made a fellow at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Brazil, and he is also member of Internet Without Borders. And he will present his research about the ELA link cable between Europe and Latin America and his innovative governance model. If it's possible, we can now begin with Roxana. It's with you.
Sure, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here in the room so early on in competition with some of the main sessions. I think this should become a main session very soon. It's a very important topic that unfortunately is not well covered at this IGF and at many of the internet governance events that I generally go to. When we talk about the internet, we often hear that the internet is decentralized. But in effect, if we look at the very basic infrastructure, the way in which communication travels, we see that there's a very high concentration. I don't know if we can maybe display a quick map of the undersea cables. I don't know if it's possible, but I'm sure all of you here in the room have already seen the map. It has generally very crowded spots and fewer lines around the global south than around the connections in the global north. And this is the situation nowadays. 97% of all communications travels via undersea cables. If you thought a lot of it has to do with satellite, it's only 3%. And there was a study that showed that in the US, was it not for the undersea cables, for some failure at some point to function properly, only 7% of all communication going out of the US would be possible via satellite. So in fact, we have a very low reliance on other means of sending information around the world. And in that sense, the cables become then a critical infrastructure. They're not treated as such for various reasons that I'm going to talk about in the next minutes. But this is something very important to keep in mind at the start of this discussion. In what concerns the governance of this space, we have a very interesting picture. It's entirely private. These cables used to be owned by the operators. They are built on the infrastructure that was created for the telegraph. So they are cables that used to belong to one or two big players. Now we see that the cost for laying such a cable on the Bed Sea is so high that not even the big players can do it on their own anymore. So we have consortia of telecom companies being in charge of these cables. We have 213 cable systems around the world. And all of these are entirely private. And what we see recently in the evolution of the discussions is that more and more companies that have made their profits out of internet content and content processing are also investing a lot in cables. So we talk about companies like Google or Facebook that will very soon have their own cables. Google is now working on connecting Singapore and Australia via one of its own cables. And we see this model expanding, and of course that poses a set of interesting challenges to the current governance model. If these companies are able on their own to transport all the data that they produce, how is the global internet connectivity going to be affected? I was saying before that the cables were laid down on what was the telegraph infrastructure. Of course, they evolved from electromagnetic copper cables to fiber optic, and even here we have a very fast growth of the technology available. However, they are not entirely exempt from disruptions and from faults. We have, in fact, a lot of incidents that have to do with internet cables, around 300 every year. We rarely ever hear about this in the West, but I think it is a recurring problem in the global South. In fact, in a study that looked at all the disruptions between 1959 and 2006, it turns out about 44% of cable faults have to do with phishing, and about 21% are linked to unknown causes, whereas about 15% have to do with anchoring practices. And this triggers a very important question, namely, how are these cables protected? Because they are points of vulnerability, increasingly so as we have concentrated hubs of communication and landing points. When we look at international law, there are a few conventions that can help us figure out where we stand with the protection of cables, and I will just go through this very quickly. The first one dates back to 1884, and it was for the protection of the submarine telegraphy. It had 40 signatories, which agreed to make it a punishable offense if somebody breaks or injures a cable. Now, what's complicated here is that the cables are in international waters, so unless you can link the vessels to a particular state, it's becoming a little bit more complicated to punish and sanction those that interfere with the cables. In 1958, the Geneva Convention on the high seas concluded that states should not obstruct the construction of undersea cables in international waters. And a convention of the UN from '82, the one on the law of the sea, made the protection of cables a priority, although they do not fall under any special provisions when it comes to military purposes or wars. So the cables cannot be protected as legitimate non-military targets in conflicts, which is an interesting point for our discussion today. But in effect, this convention from 1982 is making it a criminalizing offense to break the cables in any way, and the states all have jurisdiction to punish the vessels that interfere with these cables. Now, an interesting example of some state action in this field comes from Australia and from New Zealand, where special protection has been attributed to the landing points. In these two countries, there is something called the Cable Protection Zone, which is a designated restricted area for closely monitoring what happens to the cables. In fact, all vessels that enter this special area have to declare their position at all times, and they are under monitoring for the entire duration they spend in the protection zone. This also has to do with the fear that these countries have in having their communication disrupted, but most importantly, they also get prepared for responding militarily to such a problem. So in effect, in the cable protection zones, Australia and New Zealand can activate their military boats and can surveil everything throughout the duration of the stay of the boat there. And this is something that has been given as a good practice in this field, because the cables were not insured in any way other than by the corporate ownership they have. So to think about the protection of this critical communication, even in peacetime, from all sorts of disruptions that can occur naturally, like an earthquake or natural causes, or by human intervention, is something that I think is where the discussion should move into. Of course, when I think about the dependence on one or multiple cables, this doesn't apply to the northern part of the world. In general, the continents are very well connected. But when we look at the situation in the south, that is very, very different. We have, for example, the incident in Somalia from July 2017, where one cable was cut, and for 3 weeks there was no possibility of repairing it, and that costed about 10 million daily, the entire region. We also had an earthquake that affected Taiwan in 2006 and also had massive financial implications. It's interesting to also point out here that if you look at these hubs, the landing points or the connections where many cables are concentrated, it is enough to affect one or two to actually stop the communication, even if the other cables remain available, because they might not have the capacity to take on all the additional traffic. And this is, for example, the concern around the concentration next to Alexandria in Egypt. When it comes to the communication between Europe and Asia, if you cut 3 of these cables, more than 70% of the communication won't be possible anymore. The other point that is probably interesting for the discussion here is what happens when you actually afford more protection to these cables. Of course, now we have more unmanned vehicles that could surveil the sea bottom, but also could almost militarize these protection zones. And this is important in the context of developing countries and conflict-torn countries. Do we want to move in that direction and protect these cables from all danger, but putting even more power in the hands of some of the governments? Thank you. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxana. I had the 1-minute paper that I wanted to send to you, and I didn't have the possibility, so great for the time. It's a good transition now, because with Peter we will also talk about the shutdown and the vulnerability of the cable and how that can also have a big impact of the censorship and the freedom of expression in the countries. So Peter, feel you good?
Thank you. Thanks. I think that was an excellent introduction. Just want to underscore a couple points to start. I'll then talk about some of the vulnerabilities that I see, both to freedom of expression and access, as well as to privacy, and then talk about some of the responses in civil society and in the human rights world. So, yeah, I want to underscore that I think these cables are critical human rights infrastructure. They're not only essential to our banking, our financial systems, and everything else that we're hooking up to the internet these days, but they're essential for civilian communications, people-to-people links, and users at risk. These cables largely operate out of the public eye in secret. They're literally in the ground, under the water, and a lot of their operators and a lot of the governments that license those operators seem to be operating with a vested interest in maintaining the secrecy and cloaks of darkness over these cables. However, as human rights infrastructure, I think it's incumbent on all of us to continually raise the specter of vulnerability to these cables and vulnerability to our access to human rights in the digital age. So, first of all, I want to shout out to Steve Song, who's somewhere at this event, who really tracks these cables and their production around Africa in specific. And I say that because, again, there is not much reporting on the day-to-day management of these cables, the building of new cables, and their governance. A lot of the reporting that we do see in the Western press came out around the revelations by a former NSA contractor, Edward Snowden. So in 2013, you'll see a bevy of articles that really provided the first hard glimpse at the access that governments enjoy to many of the cables running under the seas. So the first vulnerability I'd highlight is actually surveillance and tapping, wiretapping and surveillance, and the wholesale collection of internet traffic at the landing points and elsewhere. So two programs I just want to highlight are the UK's program Tempora, that's TEMPORA, as The Guardian reported in 2013. The program took place with two principal components. One was called Mastering the Internet, and the other Global Telecoms Exploitation. They aimed at scooping up as much online and telephone traffic as possible, carried out without any public debate. One of these programs, under GCHQ's watch, had the ability to tap into and store volumes of data for up to 30 days to sift through and analyze them. So that was reported in 2013. We have to assume that the capabilities have only grown since then in the UK. This is part of what makes, I should say, the UK an intelligence superpower as one of the Five Eyes. And again, to underscore what we heard previously, this is not actually a new capability. These cables date back to the 1850s. If you look at the cable maps of telegraph cables around over 100 years ago, they map very nicely with the internet cables that are existent today. There's maybe a few more around Africa, a few more around South America. And as we're seeing some being built between South America and Europe. But the cables map nicely also to the Five Eyes governments, and you will see that not only the cables but also the volume of traffic largely runs through the Five Eyes at some point. One of the first acts by the UK government after the declaration of war in the early 20th century against Germany was to cut access to the fiber optic. The telegraph cables at that point, and so that intentional disruption shows another vulnerability of these cables. So yeah, after declaring war, Britain sent a ship out into the sea to cut 5 cables linking Germany with France, Spain, the Azores, and North America. So these cables have already, more than 100 years, about 100 years ago, been used to disrupt global communications intentionally. Getting back to the surveillance, I should mention that the National Security Agency of the United States also forces the operators of these cables to sign so-called network security agreements. The first that we know of was in 2003 with Global Crossing. An operator became a model for these agreements, which did not themselves authorize surveillance, but they did authorize or demand the ability to tap these cables be built into it by design into the infrastructure, and that the U.S. government would have ready access. I think it was within 30 minutes or so of an order being issued. So 2 takeaways, I think, from the wiretapping discussion are that, first of all, building new cables won't stop the Five Eyes, the 9 Eyes, the 16 Eyes, or even your governments, whoever they may be. Building new cables won't stop any of these governments from spying and probably accessing much of the data flowing over those cables. And the second takeaway would be that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to stop this suspicionless surveillance, which takes place often without judicial authorization. I think 3 more vulnerabilities I see are unintentional disruptions, as we've heard, intentional disruptions, and then failures of governance. So unintentional disruptions it's pretty much what it sounds like. You have sharks are one of the bigger threats to the internet, some people say. I think the story in Armenia of a grandmother digging for mushrooms, cutting off Armenia from the global internet is probably a myth, but it is pretty standard that ships will drop anchors. So that shutdown in Somalia is interesting, not only because it showed the dependence of Somalia's economy on the internet, 10 million a day, as we heard, but also because it took place during political debates. And as the country was gearing up for an election, there was a lot of suspicion that these cuts were intentional. So without transparency and a clear view of and trust in the operators and operations of these cables, we're liable to see more distrust and possibly unrest from people's suspicions about why the disruptions are taking place. And so intentional disruptions, absolutely do occur. This is one of the ways that internet shutdowns take place. We have tracked at Access Now and in the Keep It On Coalition a rise in internet shutdowns around the world. We define these as intentional disruptions that make the internet inaccessible or largely unusable and affect communications services, often with the purpose of disrupting the free flow of information. So it's a mouthful. The UN has developed another definition you'll see in the Internet Resolution in 2016, as well as the coming Safety of Journalists Resolution at the General Assembly to be approved any day now. Language on intentional disruptions of access to or dissemination of information. So this is the norm building piece, is building these norms that our communications are essential to the exercise of human rights, and intentional disruptions likely violate human rights and are something that should be dealt with in public fora, and our governments should be held accountable for. Applying these sorts of norms to the submarine cable and terrestrial cable business is not something that's been done, but we absolutely believe is necessary to protect our rights. I think the last kind of vulnerability I want to mention is failures of governance and imagination, really. So these cables are laid, often, as we hear, at great extreme expense, run by consortiums of operators in powerful countries often. And I think in the South Pacific, we saw cables being laid towards Australia, another great power, that went close by a number of islands, and didn't have the operators and those involved in planning them didn't have the imagination to think that people on these islands might actually want a fast connection to the global internet. So it took people with a social expertise and with a human rights leaning to say, perhaps that to bring everyone online by 2020 as a sustainable development goals press us to do, we should actually bring access to the greatest, most expensive infrastructure there is to some of the most vulnerable and marginalized people in the world. And so I did hear one success story of the plans being changed and many of the islands that would have been passed by being hooked up to some of these cables. There's also failures of governance in terms of activation. The cables, some of the cables running around the Horn of Africa go right up to the beach, right up to the landing point, and then die. They're dead ends simply because of lack of governance to activate those cables and to bring their benefits to the people. So a few solutions I want to highlight. First, Access Now has produced human rights principles for connectivity and development. So these principles tell investors in infrastructure, people trying to bring digital economies into grow digital economies and bring everyone into the digital age. They tell them ways to build in human rights protections by design, bring inclusivity into the planning, the process, the operation, the deployment, and the governance of telecommunications infrastructure in the digital age. These principles, include pretty simple things like, consider who's going to have access to these new capabilities. If women, if the vulnerable and marginalized will have access, and I'm happy to share those. We also point to norms like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which absolutely apply to submarine cable operators. These UNGPs tell us that due diligence is necessary. So where's the due diligence by cable operators, by these consortiums? Where is the human rights impact assessment for each new cable that's planned or brought online? Our partners at Article 19 are pioneering a lot of this work. And then I think finally, transparency. there should be public contracts on the operation of these cables. They should be subject to best practice in bidding and openness. We should have transparency as to law enforcement access to these cables, which should only take place under judicial authorization. Last point I want to make is the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace just published an awesome statement about the public core. As with most norms these days, the best part is in the footnotes, where it talks about elements of the public core, including communications cables. So I recommend you all check that out. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Just informing you that we have also 5 people who are accompanying our video online communication, so we can also talk with them, with Anna, who is responsible for the communication online. So now we are going direct to Latin America with Veridiana, who is going to contextualize us a little bit the context of infrastructure connection, governance, and everything. It's okay?
Thank you, Florence. Good morning, everyone. I'm Veridiana from Brazil. I'm part of a Brazilian organization called Intervozes that works with media concentration in general and digital rights. So we got back to the map, and this image is very strong in showing the inequalities in infrastructure distribution within the context of global interconnectivity. As Peter and Roxana said, this distribution fundamentally expresses a power relation linked to the concentration of the information flow worldwide, which raises concerns related to network neutrality, surveillance, and cybersecurity. We see a huge number of cables connecting United States to Asia, Latin America and Europe. And more than that, we see that Latin America cannot communicate with Asia without passing through the US, as well as that there is only one cable already in service, which connects Latin America to Europe without the US on the way. The other ones that are in gray there, they are not in operation yet. Likewise, currently, the American continent only communicates with Africa passing through Europe. Actually, nowadays, the connection between Africa and the rest of the world is mainly through Europe. When we look at specifically at Brazil, only 3 out of our 7 submarine cables operating in the country do not pass through US. You can pass the slide. Yeah, well, how do I do that? Can I do that from here? No. So, yeah. Okay. Okay. So one is the Brazilian coast. The other one you can put is skirting the South America from above. And one more. It's just the only direct link that we have to Europe. This logic shifts when it comes to the under construction cables. Now it's the opposite. Only 3 out of the 8 planned new cables pass through US, and 2 of them establish a direct link between Brazil and Africa, which does not exist today. And moreover, there is the Ella link that will be our second direct connection to Europe, and about which Felix will speak in more detail. So this discussion is tightly related to the challenges of universal access in the Global South, especially in terms of affordability and quality. To date, the cost of access to global data traffic via US is still at least 10 times higher for Latin America than for Europe, in addition to other distortions, such as the price of a 10 Gbps circuit between Buenos Aires and São Paulo, which is very near, being twice the amount charged between São Paulo and Miami. Among other factors, the high prices are related to the number of players in this market and the centralization of routes. More direct connections also improve the quality of the communication exchange, since we reduce the latency, which is, as you know, is the time it takes for a data package to go from one designated point to the other. Investors of one of the Brazil-Africa cables believes that with this new infrastructure, the exchange of data between the American and African continents will be 5 times faster. Great. So Brazil will have more and more diversified submarine cables, and then how does the network spread within the national territory? As you know as well, we have the backbone infrastructure which crosses the country, the backhaul one that makes the link with the backbone and the peripheral networks, and the last mile infrastructure. That is the last one, and where usually there are more conditions to small and medium ISPs to flourish, as well as community networks, initiatives when the networks are built by and for communities. Spectrum allocation is also an important element of the internet access equation. How efficient, how distributed, how democratic that allocation is. So, network universalization will hardly, in our opinion, occur counting only on market activity. It's necessary to combine private investments with public policies and regulation that set out obligations and service goals in exchange for licenses, public subsidies, and other mechanisms. We can already see in this presentation a variety of players involved. Big telecom operators, small and medium ISPs, communities operating their own networks, universities that also develop their academic networks, different government levels, and non-commercial civil society that must be involved in the elaboration of these policies and regulations. This vision reinforces the importance of a multi-stakeholder approach also to the multi-stakeholder approach also to the governance of the internet infrastructure. In Brazil, the telecommunications service that supports the internet connection, what we call the infrastructure or the physical layer, is regulated by Anatel, which is our telecom regulatory body. However, considering all the internet ecosystem and the need of multi-stakeholder processes, we also count on the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee, CGI.br, which sets out strategic recommendations for the internet, administers critical resources such as the allocation of IP addresses, and among other attributions, carries out projects to network efficiency. And I want to talk with you about one specific project, which is one project that fosters the implementation of internet exchange points, which is an interconnection in metropolitan areas of interconnection points of networks, commercial and academic ones, under a centralized management. What is this exactly? You can pass another one, please. So the most usual way to connect to the internet is establishing a commercial relation with an ISP, paying for transit. But as we know, internet is a network of networks that therefore includes home users, companies of all sizes, governmental and academic networks, etc. So it's possible to create direct links among these networks without the mandatory participation of providers. You can pass another one. I'm not assuming or stating that ISPs are dispensable. For most situations, they should be the primary means of connecting to the internet. However, it is possible. No, it's one before. Yes. However, it is possible to identify other internet participants with whom the communication through the network is relevant enough to establish a direct physical link, exchanging through this link the traffic that previously passed through the provider. This is what we call in Portuguese traffic exchange, or peering in good English. So usually this relation has a collaborative nature. That is to say, it consists of a reciprocal service between the networks involved and generally does not involve payments from one party to the other. But depending on the case, there may be payments as well. Peering is a more economic solution because there is no need to pay a provider for the traffic that is exchanged directly with the other networks. And it also enhances the quality of service since direct connections are faster and more reliable. Nevertheless, there are expenses involved. Links must be established, which usually costs a significant amount. Equipment, such as routers, may need to be replaced, and skilled labor must be available to handle the necessary configurations. In order to deal with this complexity, the Internet Exchange Points project was developed. So the IXPs exist to help internet participants to establish traffic exchange relationships, keeping its advantages while reducing the expenses and problems involved. So you can pass the other one. Okay. The concept is extremely simple. They consist of a centralized structure where several networks can interconnect to. Thus, several distinct links are not required to establish traffic exchange relationships with different networks, but only one link to the IXP. Currently, 33 Brazilian metropolitan areas host an internet exchange point, and the nature of participants interconnected is diverse, including ISPs of different sizes, content providers such as Yahoo, Netflix, universities and academic networks, banks, big companies related to other sectors. So, the CGI.br overall successful experience led to explicitly references to it in the Brazilian civil rights framework for the internet, which is known as Marco Civil. One is related to the regulation of net neutrality in Brazil, which shall involve the telecom regulatory agency, the consumer protection authority, the competition authority, relying also on CGI.br recommendations. However, recently, a warning sign was lit up regarding CGI.br and its relationship with the government, because an unilateral public consultation for restructuring the multi-stakeholder model in Brazil was carried out by the Brazilian government without discussing it previously with the committee. The process is still going on, and now with more CGI.br participation and public oversight, and also the international support for CGI.br was very important in this moment. And we are facing in Brazil right now a conservative setback in many issues with the recent FCC decision regarding net neutrality. Our regulation of net neutrality in a decree is also in danger, but we have a lot of important legal guarantees in the Marco Civil, so we cannot, the setback cannot be very hard because of the legal guarantees that we have. We also have proposal of changes in our telecom regulation that weaken the state power and some prerogatives regarding investments and also the rights of users. But we have a good news, and Felix will talk about that after me, that is related to the Ela link, and part of these investments are done by Telebrás, which is a state-owned company, a Brazilian state-owned company that was reactivated to conduct universal access policies in general. Telebrás project wasn't so well succeeded until now, but Ela Link is a good example. So to be optimistic, I will finish my intervention here and let Felix talk about a bit more, talk a bit more about the Ela Link, that is the direct link to Brazil and Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veridiana. And without transition, Felix, please.
Yes, I will try to. I will try to keep it on with the optimism, because my research in Brazil was not always optimistic, and I have been involved in submarine cables research for the past 2 or 3 years. I made a study on with the islands for affordable internet on Central Africa and Cameroon, and I realized that it was an ITU study that the prices to access to international broadband was like 2,000 times higher from Africa to Europe and US than from Europe to US, for instance. So I was a bit surprised of this inequality. And later on with Florence, we have launched this project to study the connectivity of Brazil and Latin America. But I will say a few words. Much has been said earlier on the governance of submarine cables, but it's a critical infrastructure that supports like 99% of transcontinental traffic, because it's not it's always the figure you have in the newspaper, but don't forget that there is also intracontinental traffic, which is not always So the price, I think, is 67 of the world traffic is it's a figure for the real figure. I mean, it's also a map of economic the map of economic inequalities has been shown earlier, and geopolitical tensions. It's very important in the Brazilian case, and. Of course, there is more and more studies on the continuity between the telegraph system and then the other system after the World War II, leading to the optical fiber system in which we are currently. But the most important when you research on this topic is the lack of transparency, the difficulty to access to information, and there is several evidence that the international backbone providers are doing their practice are very exclusive, and for small providers it's quite impossible to have access to the negotiations, to know what are the prices, the real prices. And when I studied in Cameroon, it was before the activation of the wax and which is a very important cable now in West Africa, for the small companies like Yumi, which is a Swiss company, by the way, it was impossible to know how much, what was the price, the real price paid by Camtel, the governmental business negotiating directly with the consortium, and it was the cost to have access to the international bandwidth was like 60% of their total costs. So it was huge, and they told me. Yes, but we have no leverage on this consortium. But they are used, and as said earlier, I won't expand on this, for major interferences such as surveillance. There is also a French program that has been revealed by the Nouvel Observateur in 2015, because France is a major link between the US and Africa and Asia. So there is 4 landing points in France, and in 2007 President Sarkozy decided to launch a program similar to the one by the GISQ and similar to the one by the NSA, and that's why they have been negotiation for France to integrate this 5 Eyes program, especially after the terrorist attacks, but it didn't happen at the end. For the shutdown, Cameroon is also a good example, because recently they have cut physically with an axe, kind of submarine axe, the cable to the Anglophone, the wax cable, this one that landed in Limbe, in the Anglophone part of the Cameroon, and with the Internet Without Borders, with the Capitaine Coalition has reported on this issue. And last but not least, it's a neutrality issue. I think it was in the MIT Technology Review, I read an article very critical on the neutrality, saying it's quite impossible to monitor breach of neutrality, because technically it's not so easy to know when the traffic is like a throttle or not, and maybe it's linked to the governance of these submarine cables as well. It's an assumption here, but it has maybe a link. But coming back to Brazil, because with Intervoces we have a kind of partnership on this issue of submarine cables, because in Brazil in 2014, Glenn Greenwald revealed that the president and many others have been wiretaped with the same program. Peter told us about earlier, and Dilma Rousseff decided to announce what was already in the pipes, which was that there was a new vast program of connectivity towards Africa and Europe to circumvent US surveillance. So it was a public statement, but in fact, after discussing with the responsible of this, one of the cables, the ELA link between Europe and Latin America, in fact, this cable was already since the early 2002, 2004, it was already like conceived or thought about, and then realized afterwards. So it was an occasion to say publicly, like the geopolitical statement, that that Brazil is going to be sovereign again in this digitally sovereign, but it was, as I will demonstrate, it was an earlier project. So the Brazilian model of governance, Veridiana was explained a lot, so I won't go back. I will add that it was a bit announced in what she said, that there was the CGI, the steering committee for internet, and there is also the RNP, which is a national network for academics, and which will be the main actor of my presentation now, because they are in the 80s. They were the first network in Brazil was operated mainly through this academic network, and they are still here. They have been created in '89, and they are still part of the ecosystem. Last, what Veridiana told us about is the new wave of submarine cables in South Atlantic. There is, you saw in gray, there is 3 cables going through Africa and 1 going to Europe. To Europe, there is already one existing one, which is Atlantis 2, but it's only for phone call and not at all for internet. And there will be a new one I will tell you about. But what is important is the 3 other ones. There is one with Angola cable system, but that is in fact linked to the Google project called Monet, linking a new cable from US to Brazil. And the second part is from Brazil to Africa. But Angola Gates is part of the Angola's cable system is part of the 2 cables, which might suggest that is linked to the Google project, this cable. And there is another one brand new, which is called Seaborn, which is directly between New York and São Paulo, and São Paulo, South Africa. It's only for not only but high frequency trading. And the last one is by the Cameroon and the Chinese, but I won't say about today. So this cable, ELA-Link, what is interesting is that usually consortium or private models are based on exclusively on commercial interests. But ELA-Link is rooted in a scientific cooperation between all academic and scientific networks in Latin America and in Europe. Back to 2002, there was a conference in Toledo, supported by the European Commission, and they decided to, because the price was very high, like 20 times higher or 40 times higher at that time, to go through US than from US to Europe, they decided to build their own infrastructure, which was a European linked to Latin America project, which is now the BELA, which is Build the European Link project. And this project is supposed to lower the prices and to guarantee a direct connectivity between the laboratories in Europe and the Paranal Observatory in Chile, which will represent 70% of astronomical data in the 21st century. So it's very important for this cooperation. It's a huge amount of data, much more than Facebook, and because it's like a space observation. And the innovation of this cable, what we found interesting is that there is, in fact, an indefeasible right granted to this scientific cooperation. Like they will possess a right to use this cable and a capacity on this cable for like 30 years, like the life of the cable. And Telebras and ELA-Link, which are the 2 companies that will exploit the commercial part, have agreed initially to grant this access to the cable, like to guarantee it. But it's now, so what we learn from our findings, that it is threatened nowadays, that Telebras and I know in some way they try to get the world capacity, and it's it's very important. And I will conclude on this, that this dual network, this way of preserving I think it's the next one, the last one, and the fact that of preserving a part of the spectrum to academic, and it's in the project it's even said non-profit organization, is very promising. It's a way to avoid what is happening right now on the commercial part of the network, which is a breach of neutrality. Universal access, for instance, in Brazil is like there is 40,000 communities that have not internet right now, and commercial businesses they don't play their role. And the RNP, this network, there is some sort of cooperation with mesh network or with community networks that could use in the future this part of the spectrum. It's a possibility. I mean, it is in the project, and one of the responsible for the project in the RNP, this scientific organization in Brazil, told me we will have a much more higher volume of capacity that needed for the scientific purpose. They will try to negotiate. Okay, and so for maybe this example, this ELA-Link project with this kind of dual internet in a way, with two networks, even if the access you can access to the whole contents, but there is two separate spectrum in a way. It's going to be a solution for solving some problem. I don't know. It's a suggestion for discussion to provide a bandwidth to non-commercial providers. To preserve a part of the network from interferences, and to provide also, as you said, Veridiana, a model of multi-stakeholder governance for this very critical infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix. So now we have finished the first part of our panel, who is the explanations. Maybe, Anna, do you know if there are some questions coming from online? So we have now more or less 15 minutes until the beginning of the next panel. And it's a very important moment for us just to exchange the relation and also understand how is the reception of this kind of information. So please, already you have a question. Maybe if you can identify yourself in order to help us to make contact. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Michael Rothert. I'm from Germany, and my association owns the D6, the world's largest peering point. I have hundreds of remarks, but I will keep it to two. The first one, I was alerted when Peter said, built-in human rights by design. Be careful. That's the same technology, dual-use technology for surveillance, for deep packet inspection, and everything else. So technology is the same if you build it, and it may be used for other things as well. And the other point with the dual internet sounds good, but it's a two-class internet that you should be aware of. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there other questions, remarks, commentaries? Yes, please.
Hi. Sorry. This is Roger Bach from Gifinet, a community network in Catalonia. My remark is on the experience. I know that the budgets are completely different and there are specific traits of each individual field, but we have a long experience in sharing management of network resources as common pool resource, as you state in your description of work. This can be contributed to you if you want. This also includes costs and also includes optical fiber, and also we are starting building small backbone, but also a backbone. And then my remark is on public money. When public money is involved, I think this is one or probably the only way we can influence, or maybe at least the most direct way, to make sure that if public money is involved, then the right to access this infrastructure should be open to everybody, because usually this ends up in being exploited or managed by private companies, and this is the way to block the access to other initiatives like community networks or small ISPs, etc.
Thank you very much. Others remarks? Are there here people who are working in the telecommunication enterprise who has already been involved in a submarine cable consortia or construction? Or maybe in the elaboration of the project for the public government? Who can give us a little bit of experience? Okay. No question online? In Latin America, it's 6 o'clock in the morning, so we cannot expect a lot of hours citizens. Great. Okay. Thank you, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I was trying to phrase my question as I was listening to you, so I'm sorry I took some time. My name is Christiane Roy. I'm based here in Geneva. I'm in the Canadian Permanent Mission. First of all, thank all the panelists for your insight, because for me personally, even if I look at digital issues, this issue is a bit nebulous because, as you say, it's not very transparent, unfortunately. So I have two questions. One is for you, Ms. Valeria. You talked about peering, but my understanding of peering is something completely different. It's something that happens, in one big conference annually where the telcos sort of exchange number of clients and again, because these are all resulting in secret agreements which are not open, it's very closed. But what you were describing, I guess, was something different. But because you were naming it the same thing, I think it maybe created confusion for me. Okay. So I don't know if you could explain a little bit different what you meant and how it's different. That would be useful. And my second question is for Peter. I was wondering if you had started to approach private sector entities and consortiums, and how have they been receiving your proposals? Thank you very much.
Great. Maybe we have a first block of questions for you to answer. Who wants to begin? There is two questions for Peter.
Sure. Yeah. Happy to. Yeah. And thank you for speaking up, especially as an operator. I think we really do need the private sector to be a huge part of these talks and discussions to understand how this actually works in practice. So as far as building in human rights by design, I take your point. I think that we do want to see neutrality in the content and what's flowing over the network. I think building out space for public use is interesting. I would, as far as the two-tiered, I would hope there would be some sort of blinds, so you don't know which is which necessarily as the operator, that you treat them neutrally and using the same best efforts at service delivery, end-to-end connection, innovation without permission, the other net neutrality principles. Building in human rights by design, I think, doesn't necessarily need to change the tech. The tech should always be, optimized for efficiency and speed and bandwidth. I think what we're talking about are protections around process and operation to bring in diverse communities into the discussion of the building, the financing, the managing of these cables, and to ensure that they do benefit all in the society, especially when there's public money involved. And so, with Camtel in Cameroon, being a key player in the delivery of this cable, it's really sadly ironic that the country has intentionally shut down internet access to a fifth of its population for much of this year. And that shows us, I think, a failure of governance and the fact that building new infrastructure does not mean new capacity to exercise human rights, much less economic rights in the digital age, that more needs to be done. And yeah, I think the second question was, yes, whether we've approached the cable provider industry. we've talked a bit with Microsoft. Actually, Microsoft does have a large cable business that you don't hear about, I would say, as much as some of their other products. They have teams of lawyers negotiating with governments and negotiating access and government access. I think there does need to be more work done in civil society, I do look for some support and resources. We have 77 intentional internet shutdowns this year. That is a very current pressing problem, and an acute problem that we're trying to combat. And so to take our energy and focus on these potentials and these much more shady industries is it's not always easy. But I do think it is incumbent on all of us to try and do that.
Thank you. Veridiana?
Okay, thank you. First, I would like to stress the remark about the need of the cables that are constructed, not only submarine, but infrastructure in general, built with public investment. They should be open to not only to other private players, but to community initiatives and other public initiatives as well. So the LLink has this innovative governance modus operandi, I can say, but it's more related to academic participation than other civil society initiatives. So this is an important remark to have in mind in this, in the way that the LLink will be governed. Regarding your question, thank you for that. Yeah, we call peering. I think that the most properly name would be traffic exchange if we would translate it directly from Portuguese. Sometimes we call peering because it involves a negotiation that it's not the traffic. It doesn't involve payment, so it's an exchange of traffic without paying for transit, which would be the other kind of contract. I mean, but of course it's done in this national level and in a much more transparent way, and it's not only related to other connection providers, but also involves a lot of kinds of an autonomous system. So it's a project that exists in Brazil. I don't know I don't know if this is also replicated in other countries, but it's a really good experience that we have in Brazil that is carried out by the CGI.PR, the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee, and it's done in a transparent way because it's carried out by the CGI.PR, which is a multi-stakeholder body. So it's different from the peering agreements that you were saying, and I use this word much more because it's related to traffic exchange agreements that initially doesn't involve payments. And this is a very important initiative regarding internet efficiency, regarding the traffic management of the data flows. So I don't know if you could understand what I said, but it's much more a way of translating it in a way that people understand. But the best way of saying it would be, I guess, traffic exchange then.
Maybe before giving the possibility to Roxana and Felix make their considerations, are there others questions or commentaries? Because we have just 5 minutes until finishing the session. Are you sure? Last possibility to say something. Okay, so maybe if Roxana and Felix have something also, another consideration according to these commentaries, please.
Yes, thanks for the question on the dual use. It's true that two-class internet. Yes, I think nowadays, given the FCC decision and what happened, it was a reaction because I discovered this governance model, which is not a governance model, by the way, because it's still negotiating. They are still negotiating in Brazil and in Europe on the cable these days. It's almost finished. so the governance of the cable itself is not yet settled at all. It's the beginning. But yes, I reacted to this FCC decision and to also like 40% of submarine cables are also today are funded by GAFAs. So it means that tomorrow they will, the system won't be kind of. It was always the case in the 90s. Like big telecom players like AT&T, well, in the party, it was not the case that it was a one-class system, and nowadays it's even worse. So, given this trend, maybe this kind of solution, like using part of the spectrum on a cable operated by commercial operators, is a way to preserve some sort of open internet, and especially in universities, well, like for knowledge, for education, and maybe for other like non-profit organization or public organization. And I jump on the second question on the fact that is public investment is very important for us as civil society to have leverage. It's true in the case of Brazil that because it's Telebras and it's a huge project, 72 terabits for the link. It's like the whole Brazil, at least, or the whole Latin America, in terms of connectivity for the future. So it's very big and it's a lot of money invested by public governments. So they are more sensible, and we have a kind of room to maneuver here as civil organization, which is very interesting because in the case of the Angola cable or the money cable with Google, I don't know if we have any leverage on this. It's more difficult. So it was my answer to. So thank you.
Thank you. I think I would simply like to reiterate this call for having more research in this field and also more transparency around some of the processes of governance. It would definitely help to have a public discussion out of this and be able to see a little bit more about the operations of the companies, about their respect for human rights, if they can be forced to put this on the list of priorities. Obviously, it isn't the case right now. And also on the discussion around the special protection, this is a point of vulnerability for the internet, and I think we have to put more efforts into discussing what can be done to avoid these intentional and unintentional disruptions of internet communications. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxana. Maybe I can invite all the people who are interested to keep contact with us or to have more interaction with this topic. You can come here and give us your contacts first, and very important also to build these networks and keep changing. We are extremely punctual, not for the beginning, but for the conclusion. I think now we have another session is going to begin at 10:40, so maybe people are going to be interested to stay. Thank you very much for everybody. Have a nice and interesting and expanding session at the IGF. And I will concluding like the jury here. I have the possibility. The session is closed.
It's funny.
I also did
my life.
the students are as I think it's like really shows like concrete like an actual.
All right. Finished.
Good. You have only one? No.
What?
You have several panels?
No.
You're done.
I don't have many panels to prepare. I have all the meetings and things like that. We are based in Belo Horizonte.
No, it was good.
Translations.
Yeah.
And, translations. All right. Finished. Good. You have only one? No.
You have several panels?
I don't have many panels to prepare. I have all the meetings and things like that. We are based in Belo Horizonte.
We just finished a session, so I don't know what's next.
Yeah, we just finished.
Trying to correlate the panel with the
Without borders.
You're welcome to sit. I don't mind.
Not on the podium, though.
No, you can ask. You can do it for some time.
What is the session?
Are you
Dynamic collision on trade.
Yes.
dynamic coalition of creators?
Digital trade.
Trade, sorry.
All right. No, it's really.
I'm just coming, not asking questions.
I missed you at GCCF.
Oh, well, also have a problem of like-minded countries driving agendas. All countries driving agendas. Even if they include India as a cooperation. It's a cooperation. It's a cooperation. They did it because this guy looks like so they're going to check the invite us to come to the
yeah. So we think it's right. That's bilateral group 2. That's what we're yeah. It's so from the log you take that split down, you go straight, and it's right around the corner from this one that's restroom. It's right there. So that's where we're directing all the participants. So hopefully they won't will all like all I have to see. No, I'd like to see this session. This is the training session.
negotiating is not good. January and mid-January. And Canada, of course, is what Canada is. They would have had good books are the best that gets redecided.
Good morning, all. We're going to start soon. I know there's still a few stragglers who are waiting to join us. If you are here for the Dynamic Coalition on Trade and the Internet, then you're in the right place. Otherwise, you may be in the wrong place.
Do you know if there are going to be any more presentations? So I can upload them now?
I don't think so. I think that's all.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, no problem.
And it will be here, will it? Once it goes
It'll
up?
be here.
Good.
It just, right now there are captions.
Yep. I think we'll start at 10:45 just to give people, I know there's at least one or two people who are still coming. Hello. Okay, good morning again, everyone. I think the flow of new entrants has slowed, so why don't we begin? Welcome to the inaugural meeting of the IGF Dynamic Coalition on Trade and the Internet. I'm going to open by giving a few remarks describing how this dynamic coalition came into being and why. And then we'll start talking about the outputs that we've been working on during the year, and have a little briefing on the state of play in trade in the internet, of which you've been able to hopefully learn more through other sessions during this IGF and upcoming sessions as well. And then the last third or so of the meeting will be about what do we want to do for next year, and probably that's the most important part. There are some documents up here which I'll tell you about in a minute. But first, a little background. So before there was an IGF Dynamic Coalition on Trade in the Internet, there was a mostly civil society group with a few private sector members called the Open Digital Trade Network, which was formed in 2016, and the reason for the formation of the Dynamic Coalition was to make it fully multi-stakeholder and to integrate it better with the Internet Governance Forum. So it was formally recognized by the MAG in February this year. And when I compare the two groups, the Open Digital Trade Network and the Dynamic Coalition, two of the most important differences are that the Dynamic Coalition is more diverse. We have more participation from all of the stakeholder groups, and we have completely open membership and an open email list, whereas the other group is has a closed list just so that there can be some sort of strategizing outside of the open email list that the Dynamic Coalition has. We have 42 members when last I checked, and here is a graph, a pie chart, which shows the composition. It's not unusual for civil society to be the majority of any of the dynamic coalitions. I think that's pretty normal. This may be slightly exaggerated because I couldn't tell if some of the civil society people were actually civil society or academic or technical community. So probably the civil society part of this graph should be a little less than it's shown here. But what you can see is that we've got about a quarter of industry and academic members, which is not bad. Probably technical community has more than that, but that's all that I could find on the membership list, and likewise intergovernmental members. We have a government member who's not shown on this chart. I think I may have left that off inadvertently. So. Given that we have also a government member, we have all of the stakeholder groups represented as members of the Dynamic Coalition. Now, when the DC was formed, I think this year, being the first year of the Dynamic Coalition, and since we haven't met before, a lot of the work that we've done could be regarded as just some preparatory work for what we're going to do in the future, right? So one of the main things that we wanted to do was to create a background paper which would be a resource for us going forward, and which everyone could use to get up to speed on areas that they're not as familiar with, and to read about what's happened so far in different venues and the different initiatives that have taken place. So we created this background paper. I have only a few copies. In fact, no, they've all gone. Okay, I have no more copies of the background paper available. However, it is available online. So we can distribute those to people who don't have hard copies. I've said this a few times on the mailing list, but just to reiterate, if there's something in the background paper that you disagree with, it's not a normative document. We're not saying that this is a statement of the Dynamic Coalition or anything like that. It's really just a resource for capacity building. So we can and will update it, but it's really just meant as a resource to help you and to help us all going forward, and provide a sort of common understanding of the state of play of trade in the internet. So congratulations also to Jyoti Pandey, who did the majority of the work on that. But we did have input. We did have some comments from members of the Dynamic Coalition, which helped to get it into the final form that it is now. And then the other thing that we worked on this is worded in our work plan. It isn't as explicit as saying that we would actually have a resolution. But what we've come up with is a draft resolution about transparency and inclusiveness in international trade negotiations. And there are a few more copies of that up here. If you don't have one and you want to come and grab it, we have a few more copies here. Now, this document we worked on during the year online on the mailing list. We put it up on a Google Doc. We had quite a large number of comments, which were all integrated. One of the things that we were cautious of is that because, unlike the background paper, this one we do want to be able to reach a rough consensus around it in this group. And because it's such a diverse group, we had to take a great deal of care in drafting this to make sure that it was something that everyone could live with. And so, apart from the comments that we received online, I also had some one-to-one discussions with people who had particular expertise to ask them, look, are we on the right track here? There's also a number of existing resources that we drew upon, which are referenced at the back of the document. And we're going to go through that a little bit later in this session, because ideally I would like to see us coming to a rough consensus that this is something that we want to endorse. And given that we're all participants in the Internet Governance Forum, which is built on the ideals of transparency and multi-stakeholder participation, I don't think it'll be too difficult for us to endorse this, this resolution. So that is coming up next. And the other thing we wanted to do, which I don't think we've been as successful as we wanted to be, was in just building out the dynamic coalition and bringing members of the trade community. We have some, but as I said, we only have one government member. It'd be great if we could get some more. So I think that's one of the parts of our 2017 work plan that we will probably want to carry over to 2018. So, and the final, the final part of our 2017 work plan was to actually meet today, which we're doing, so that's great. Now, I am going to, before I go into the future, that'll be another part of this, the final part of this meeting. Before that, I'm going to hand over to Jyoti, who's going to go through the background paper. She's not going to go through all of it because it's like 66 pages long, but she's going to give an outline of what's in there. So kind of an executive summary, I guess. So I'm going to hand over to Jyoti.
Thanks, Jeremy. Good morning, and thank you for being here. I'm Jyoti Pandey, and I work with Jeremy at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm very new to trade-related issues, while I've worked in internet governance, and one of the issues coming into this area was that while there's a lot of information available, it's not available in one compact place, especially from a layman's perspective. So as Jeremy clarified, the background paper was created as an informational resource for people who are interested in trying to draw connections between trade and internet governance issues and how they are connecting more and more as states take these forward. Again, I open with the caveat that this is not a normative document, and it does not represent the position of all the members of the dynamic coalition. Also, apologies if I keep looking at my laptop and I'm not looking at the audience, because I do have to go through a lot. So without further ado, I'll start with the background paper. The WTO agreements were developed in the pre-cyber age, and while the role of nation states in regulating physical goods and services has been established in the global trade order, the role of nation states with respect to cross-border flow of information is not very well understood at the moment. Existing internet governance frameworks approach from a multi-stakeholder perspective decision-making, and where state and non-state actors address issues through open and transparent arrangements of rulemaking, which is very different from traditional trade areas where states are the negotiating parties. So in the absence of global binding norms on internet-related issues, and in light of fears of digital protectionism, states are seeking to draw up rules and frameworks for the digital economy through these conventional trade mechanisms, such as plurilateral or multilateral trade agreements, or at the WTO. Although trade and internet governance appear to be disconnected, with the growing significance of the internet for international trade, a tenuous and complex relationship between the fields is emerging, which will have repercussions for the digital economy. Regulating commercial aspects of the internet through trade agreements requires coming up with global solutions that strike a balance between trade liberalization and the preservation of fundamental goals such as openness and transparency and the protection of human rights. It also requires resolving certain political and ideological stances on issues like privacy, innovation, and democratic standard setting. So despite recent initiatives, there is an open question whether trade agreements should be concerned with setting standards for internet technologies or on issues such as national security and privacy. It is very important that we understand the complexities and the risks involved in aligning the disciplines of trade policy and internet governance. So with the aim of bringing in a multi-stakeholder approach to the application of international trade, this paper is a resource developed for the Dynamic Coalition on Trade and Internet Governance, summarizing some of the issues, concerns, and the state of play that is developing in some of these global trade arenas. The paper is divided in 4 parts. The first section deals with the history of intellectual property and trade frameworks. So we've covered the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was the first worldwide multilateral free trade agreement. The GATT remained in effect until the World Trade Organization was established in April 1994. This was followed by the General Agreement on Trade in Services, which contained explicit commitments for telecommunications and for financial services. And both of these issues underlie several e-commerce issues. The GATT has, importantly, the GATT set a standard because it created 2 sets of exceptions. The general and national security exceptions, under which signatories can restrict trade in the interest of protecting public health, public morals, privacy, national security, or intellectual property. And these issues we'll see keep coming up in these negotiations. After the GATS, we had the Information Technology Agreement. The mandate of